the flickering light of Asia, or the Assyrian nation and church. The Assyrian forces remained long enough in Salamis to make it possible for the 40,000 Christian refugees to vacate the district and start safely on their journey toward Urmia. The Turks, who in some way became cognizant of the flight of the Christian population, took this movement as a sign of weakness on the part of the Assyrian army and made terrific assault on the Assyrian positions. Agha-Petros and his inadequate force were made a target for the concentrated fire of the Turkish batteries. The Assyrians, however, accepted the challenge and returned the compliment, hurling back the Turkish hordes, taking again some captive together with another gun of large caliber. When the last train of the refugees had safely crossed the hills that separate the Urmia plateau from Salamis district and were within the sight of the former city, the Assyrian troops withdrew in perfect order, following the caravan of frightened men, women, and children, and giving them protection also from any possible attack by the Muslim population through which they were passing. On the arrival of the Assyrian forces in Salamis, the semicircle chain of hills which walls Urmia plateau was dotted with Turkish batteries, and the Turkish infantry was preparing to attack from the three directions. Agha-Petros's army had gone without sleep for 3 consecutive nights, while the Assyrian forces which were left in Urmia were holding back the right wing of the enemy. The weary warriors of Salamis battles threw themselves against both the center and the left wing of the Turks. The foreign observers have found no words with which to express their admiration for the bravery and the courage of the Assyrians. It seemed, however, that the fear of the great warriors had fallen upon the Turks. An Assyrian colonel by the name of Azariah Khan, who later became famous as a general and who had always, in every engagement with the Muslims, borne the brunt of battle, with few of his men stole his way through the Turkish lines, jumping from behind one rock to the shelter of another, scaled the steep slope of their Seir mountain, till he and his men stood unobserved over and behind the Turkish infantry, supported as it was by the Turkish mountain batteries. The guns of both sides were contending furiously. The Turks had the advantage of higher positions. The Assyrian colonel, with his 5 men and a machine gun, which they had borne upon their soldiers, waited patiently for their comrades below to draw the fire of the Turkish infantry. This was done, and the Assyrian machine gun was let loose with its rapid firing, while from behind the 5 positions purposely selected remote from each other, the individual fire of the 5 Assyrian sharpshooters added to the impression of a strong attack in the rear of the enemy. It was a most hazardous attempt on the part of the Assyrian colonel, but it was also a most cleverly designed move conceived by him, which turned out to yield the desired effect. The strongest resistance of the Turks was thus broken. The enemy began to retreat, and his retreat soon assumed the form of a hasty flight, leaving in the hands of the pursuers mountain guns and large quantities of war material. The army of Agha-Petros and the other Salamis forces, weary and exhausted after the disappearance of the broken fragments of the Turkish army of invasion, bivouacked in the open and slept in the luxuriant grass of the mountains some 30 miles away from Urmia, before they were able to return from the pursuit of the enemy. As told, the Assyrians within the space of 6 weeks fought 14 victorious battles with the Turks. It was learned from the Turkish prisoners that the Turkish soldier had no desire, nor courage, nor ambition to fight, and that he was driven into the field of action against his will by the cruel whip of his masters. But throughout these battles, the Assyrians were daily waiting for some news from the British forces in Persia, and also for some supplies of war material, which was promised to them so solemnly by the British Captairi Gracie. The ammunition left by the retiring Russian army was now highly exhausted. Some quantities of the war material were also left by the Russians in the small port of Sharabakhana on the other side of the lake of Urmia, but it probably had been confiscated by the nearby Muslims of Tabriz. The latter had become bold again. The Turks, after the withdrawal of the Assyrian army from Salamis, had entered the capital of the Persian Azerbaijan. The foreign consulates, with the exception of the American, had been deserted, and their occupants had fled from the fear of the approaching Turks. Still, the Assyrians took a chance by sending a boat with 160 men to attempt the bringing of the much-needed ammunition left in the port of Sharbakana. The captain of the new Assyrian boat, which was also left by the Russian army, was a Russian, but it was never known that he was a Bolshevik till the fatal day of the disaster. The boat arrived at the port. It was observed by the Turks and the Muslims of Tabriz, whose presence there was cleverly concealed by the Assyrian troops. The Assyrians landed. As they began to move toward the storehouse, they saw the enemy coming. They thought their way back to reach the boat, but the boat was gone. It was driven farther out into the lake by the Bolshevik Russian captain. The Assyrians were captured and their bodies were literally mutilated. The fragments of their bones and skulls were later gathered, through the permission secured by the American consul in Tabriz, and taken to the latter city, where they were buried in the Christian cemetery. The Assyrian National Associations of America donated funds for a monument, which was erected on the graves of the great heroes of Sharbakana, who volunteered to take the terrible risk and sacrifice their lives in order to save their nation from total extermination. All hope, therefore, of getting any supply of ammunition was gone, and if the Turkish army of Salamas undertook to make an attack, as it surely would, and if the battle was to remain undecided for any length of time, the doom of all the Christian people was regarded and absolutely sealed. Because of this awful predicament, the Assyrians had been unable to take full advantage of their great victories. After a crushing defeat, they had let the broken fragments of the Turks and the Kurds go. The Turkish prisoners stated that their comrades were often ready to surrender in large numbers if only their pursuit had been continued a little longer. But the Assyrians could not afford to do so. They had no ammunition, so this little nation, this little Germany, as it was nicknamed by its enemies, was left all alone, surrounded by the millions of Muslims, the object of persistent and tenacious attacks by the Turks, having lost all it possessed, deserted by its allies, hoping against hope for the fulfillment of its allies' promises, without ammunition and without an avenue of escape. Where is the nation that could have stood all this? Did any of the great powers give the snap of their finger whether the brave and loyal nation, this brave little ally, perished in the whirlpool of their own making, or survived the greatest disaster in history? Does it not now appear that they were all trying to pull only their own chestnuts out of the fire? With all the cruelties attributed to the German army, there is not one to compare with the heartless isolation of the small Assyrian nation, which had staked her faith, risked her very existence on the solemn pledges and most emphatic promises made to her by her selfish allies. And today, the Jews have their land, the Armenians have their Armenia, the Kurds, the bitter enemies of the Assyrians, have a kingdom promised to them. The Arabs, the treacherous Arabs, the pronounced saints of a murderous Islam, have been given an Assyrian city for the capital of their new kingdom. But the Assyrians are left with the mercies of their former enemies, without a home, without money, living on charity, perishing from hunger and exposure in the cities of Persia, dwelling in tents in the deserts of Mesopotamia. Their claims laughed at, their aspirations ridiculed, mocked, and treated like wild beasts, and now deprived also of the benefits of the great American philanthropy, who is responsible for all this. There is surely a day of retribution for all forms of injustice. The infallible tribunal, even though shamefully rejected by the so-called Christian nations, still sits upon his everlasting throne. He will mete out justice, many measures for each measure. He alone is the hope of the sin-smitten world, and his coming kingdom only can apply the balm that will heat the gaping wounds of the oppressed pierced by the heartless selfishness of man. As the subsequent pages will offer a more logical space for the present woes of the Assyrians, we return back to Urmia to behold the plight of the bravest people on earth, but left without necessary means with which to hurl back their enemies and the enemies of their allies. The Turkish army of Salamas commenced its march from the north against Urmia, the deep pass through which the enemy was to make his way, and the steep hills that he was to scale, constitute some of the mightiest fortifications of nature. But the defenders require mountain batteries to return the fire of the large guns of the Turks. The Assyrians had a few of these guns, but they were now of no use. They were speechless. They had consumed almost entirely the small quantity of the food left for their consumption. The few shells they had left were being saved for extreme emergency. The Assyrian relief under God upon their valor. The roar of the Turkish cannon came closer and closer. They were now on the plateau. To their left was the salt lake of Urmia. To their right, the friendly hills of the notorious Simku. They were to pass a promontory that stretched its pointed nose toward the nearby inland lake. Under the southern brow of this rocky projection, the Assyrians waited, while a contingent of their comrades were likely eagles, climbing the steep slopes of the mountains on the right flank of the enemy. The Turkish batteries were kept furiously active, vomiting a deluge of Islam's wrath. Their deafening roar played the notes of the gladdest song of the Caliph's holy war, while their shells dropped in endless succession, tearing and ploughing the ground as they struck. The Assyrian troops who were sent to scale the mountains on the right flank of the enemy had done so, and they signaled their success to their brethren on the other side of the mountain projection. The Turks turned to the right, along the highway leading to the bridge of Nazlu River. The Assyrians gave their accustomed yell, "In thy name will we fight, Marshamun Binyamin," and threw themselves desperately upon the advancing enemy. Instantaneous with this move, the other Assyrians made their flank attack. As the enemy was marching in close formation, it suffered fearfully from the terrific fire of its opponents' machine guns, which were cleverly planted on the slope that commanded the highway. The Kurdish element in the Turkish army field. The suddenness of the attack confused and demoralized the Turks once more. They turned east toward the lake, and then north again along its shore. Decisively defeated, they retreated and returned to the pass through which they had marched, and waited there unpursued, till they were reinforced by additional forces in their rear. Another opportunity was lost to the Assyrians. They yearned to follow the enemy, but they had no factory to replace their empty cartridges, and as for the solemn promises of their allies, they were now almost forgotten. A very remarkable incident took place shortly after this victory. By making mention of it here, the reader will be able to form some idea as to the character of the Assyrians, in their conception of the principle involved in one's word of honor, of this excellent virtue. The Persian Assyrians, I regret to say, are almost absolutely barren. They are emotional, changeable, and unreliable. Perhaps their long oppression as subjects has made them so. Their environments under the tyranny of their Muslim masters have hindered them from cultivating that moral excellency which has always appeared in suburb and matchless grandeur among their mountain and independent brethren. The Assyrians had quite a number of Turkish officers among their prisoners of war. These officers had witnessed the kindness with which their fellow captives had been treated by their war enemies, and had particularly noticed the attention that was paid by the latter to their wounded soldiers. And as to the conduct of the Assyrians toward the officers themselves, the latter had not anticipated it, and in their own confession they could never look for it anywhere else. They came to have a sincere sympathy for the isolated Assyrian people. They honestly desired to save the Assyrian nation from extermination in a land that looked like a vast surging Islam sea. They sought an interview with the leaders of the Assyrian nation, and they spoke to them in the following manner. You are absolutely the bravest people on the face of the earth. Your courage is most unique. Your valor incomparable. You are truly a Christian people. We have seen this in your conduct, not only towards us, but also toward all your enemies. You are lions in the war, but lamb-like in your victory. Unfortunately, however, you're a small nation. You cannot replace your slain. You cannot continue to fight millions of your foes. Turkey will eventually bring up a mighty army that will flood and overwhelm you, and you have no resources to sufficient supply of ammunition, and no factories to manufacture the same. We are telling you this honestly. You have been deserted by your allies. They are absolutely selfish. They are all seeking their own. Where are the pledges that were made to you? Where are the cannon or the guns or the ammunition that were promised you? Where is the British army? You have been left alone to fight the battle of your allies. It is not your own battle. They will never fulfill toward you what they have promised. You have waited patiently for the fulfillment of those pledges. Now we should not be telling you this. You have seen it all for yourselves. Come now and make peace with Turkey. We know you feel that you cannot rely upon her word. We know that you fear you will be betrayed, but we will take up the cause for you. Leave it to us. And while we are still your captives, we will negotiate those terms for you. We will arrange to secure for you the most satisfactory guarantees you need. Only say the word. Nor do we want you to take the initiative in the matter by which you might give an impression of weakness on your part. We will take up the negotiations. We will suggest the proposition for the mutual benefits of both sides. It will pay you to make an alliance with the Turks. No matter what the final issues of the Great War may be, Russia is out of the game. You will not be called upon to take arms against your former friends. England and the other allied nations are remote, and you will have no occasion to face them in hostilities. Look after, seek your own destiny, consider your own future, and think of yourselves first and last. You just say the word and leave the matter to us. We have learned to appreciate you and love you. We honestly desire your best good. Are not these words an accurate commentary? Did they not speak the truth? Did not these intelligent Turkish officers understand the real game of the war? Did they not speak in prophetic foresight, at least so far as the Assyrians were concerned? Who would not have yielded to this most solicitous pleading? Who would not have grasped such an opportunity when placed in such a position? What answer should the Assyrian leaders have given to this honest and imploring appeal of the Turkish officers, every syllable of which meant under the circumstances the best interest of the small Assyrian nation? Some of the leaders of the Persian Assyrians were moved and yielded at once. They suggested an immediate armistice. They would make peace with the Turks, and if necessary, they would form an alliance with them. But fortunately, members of this element were very small and ineffective minority in the councils of their nation. They were destined, however, later to the play of their unpatriotic, selfish, and hired part of the detriment of the Assyrians' cause. But what about the mountain Assyrians? Could they ever think of bearing a stigma on their fair name? Could they ever think of the proving false and going back on their word? Could they betray England, to whose representative they had solemnly given their pledge? Nay, nay, a mountain Assyrian would rather die than do a shameful and sinful act like that. The promise made to their allies must be kept under all circumstances. It mattered not what their allies did. They were an honorable people. They were neither false nor cowards. Once they had made a pledge, they were going to stand by if come what may. They would fight to the last man unto the end. They had better be wiped off from the face of the earth than it ever be said of them that they in an emergency had proved untrue and had betrayed their friends. They decided to remain loyal and hold the front allotted to them at all risks and all hazards. With their ammunition rapidly dwindling, the Assyrians planned to be on the defensive only. The topography of the land was in their favor. Their forces could seek the protecting shelters made numerous by the formation of the high mountains, and thus avoid any serious damage from the Turkish bombardments. They would depend upon God, on the success of close battles and hand-to-hand fighting, for which they were famous. Their machine guns still had a supply of the tiny shells, even though they would have to make use of them with strict economy. These guns, which were a terror to the advancing army, could be planted unexposed along the only paths that made Urmia accessible to the invaders. Audaciously, they chose either to vanquish their foes or be vanquished by them and then be annihilated. Face to face with such gloomy prospects and bewildered as to what had happened to the promised British expedition that would bring them both assistance and the much-needed supply of war material, they were surprised one day by the whirling sounds that descended from the sky. It was a clear and bright summer day, to be accurate. It was on the 25th day of June, when they saw a hornet-like object soaring high in the dazzling firmament that hung over the ancient city of Media. It came lower and lower. First, it was fired upon as an enemy observation aeroplane. Then the British flag was sighted, and an overjoyous Christian population thought of the festal reception to be accorded to the approaching British soldiers. The friendly flyer alighted and landed near the camp of the bravest troops that had ever defended the name and the honor of the British Empire. The captain rose up from his seat, surrounded by the Assyrian officers. He was escorted to the presence of Marshamun Polus, and there he told his story in the hearing of Aga Petros, other Assyrian generals, and the Assyrian clergy. He delivered the gladsome news that the British expedition would arrive in Sayan-Khala, Persia, within 2 weeks, with arms of all kinds and abundant ammunition, and that an Assyrian expedition should be dispatched to meet the former and return together to Urmia. Having delivered his message, the British officer returned to his machine and flew back to whence had come. The road from Urmia to Sayan-Khala was situated through the most dangerous passes in an enemy land. Besides the bitter animosity of an exclusively Muslim population, the country was overrun by the straggling elements of the broken Turkish southern forces. The officers of these isolated troops had conducted a regular campaign of the Holy War. They had succeeded in rallying to their assistance considerable forces from among the distant Kurdish tribes, and from among the Persian Muslims as well. Whoever led the expedition must therefore have a sufficient number of men with him in order to be able to open his way to Sainkala, which would require a steady march of several days. General Agha Petros undertook the task, but owing to the pressure by the Turks from the north, he took with him only about 1,000 men of the cavalry, unfeeling certain that the Assyrians would be able to hold their own in Urmia till he returned with the British expeditionary force. Providence, however, had willed otherwise. There are no incidents or accidents that can possibly come to pass without the permission of Him who holds the destinies of all nations of His omnipotent hand. There may be an inexcusable negligence or some inexpectable circumstances which appear to weave the fabric of earthly events, but not a warp nor a woof was ever twisted together for the material that makes history, but that it came out of the spinning wheel of an infallible wisdom. He who sees the single hairs as they fall from the heads of men surely holds the all-controlling interest in the future of individuals and nations in the palm of his hand. The entire history of the Assyrian people from the beginning of the Great War answers to an almost exact duplicate of the sad history of the Hebrew slaves in Egypt. Every event during those weary years of flight, exile, and warfare, every calamity and every threatened catastrophe, every hope that remained like an unreal dream, and every disappointment, every exhibition of their amazing valor, and every battle from which they emerged victorious, all the pressure from the overwhelming forces of Turkey, and all the hatred of the combined elements of Islam, only made known to the unconscious Assyrians that neither Urmia nor the other part of the adjoining lands was a proper place for them to dwell, and that they must return to their own ancient and historic fatherland. So Agha Petros and his mounted men arrived safely in Sainkala, but no British expedition could be seen there. A small contingent of the latter troops had arrived at the place appointed, but on finding strong signs of enemy's presence, they had already departed into the interior of Persia.